Search the scriptures as Christ our God said in the Gospels, for in them we find him.
Welcome, dear brothers and sisters, to Search the Scriptures Live, where we interpret the Bible according to the thought and the writings of the early church. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantino. Today is Monday, June 2nd, 2025, and this is lesson 117 on the Gospel of Matthew. If you wish to join us live tonight, you can call into the program with your comments or your questions by calling us at 855-237-2346, 855, and that number spells out AF Radio. If you have a phone who can do that sort of thing. So tonight, yes, we're talking about the mirror bearers. We're going to learn about the women who followed Christ, what life was like for them. But first, let's begin with our prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Illumine our hearts, O Master, who loves mankind, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand thy gospel teachings. Implant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, that trampling down all carnal desires, we may enter upon a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things that are well-pleasing to thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies, O Christ our God, and to thee we ascribe glory, together with thy Father who is from everlasting, and thine all-holy and good and life-giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. So, as everyone knows, only the women disciples of Jesus remained with him until the very end, until he died on the cross, with the sole exception of John, the beloved disciple. And Matthew, at this point in his narrative, he notes these particular women were witnesses of the death of Christ, and they're also going to witness his burial, and they're going to be witnesses of his resurrection. Now, this gives a certain amount of historical credence and support to the fact that Christ, first of all, actually died and that he rose again. And there was no concern or mistake about where he was buried. You know, this is the kind of thing that people will say today. Oh, they forgot where the tomb was. They went to the wrong tomb, or he never really died. All of these things, they really are dismissed or easily dismissed because of the fact that we have numerous witnesses, not just one, but numerous witnesses who saw him die, saw him being taken down, saw him being prepared for burial and placed in the tomb and returned on Sunday morning. So the Lord was really dead, and then when he appears again later, he is truly alive. But what is very, very ironic about this is that these women were not the persons that, if somebody was to invent the story of the resurrection, that they would have chosen. And that's what makes their testimony, their witness about the resurrection, about meeting the risen Lord, all of these things, that's what makes it actually more believable. Because in first century Judaism, women were not allowed to give testimony. They weren't allowed to testify to anything except one circumstance, and that was the death of their husband if they were the only person around. They were on a journey someplace and no one else was around to witness that he had died. A wife could give testimony that her husband died. But other than that, because out of necessity, other than that, women were not allowed to give testimony to Jews in courts. They were not considered credible witnesses. So if someone were to make up the story of the resurrection, the last thing that they would do are choose as initial witnesses a group of women, because that would not be believed. And in fact, that's exactly what we see happening in the case of the disciples, right? So this really testifies to the factual aspect of the discovery of the empty tomb by these women. So here are some of the things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about who the mirror bearers were. What were their names? What was life like for women in first century Judaism? What kind of women would have been followers of Jesus? And how important would they have been in the early church? Did they merit the title apostle, for example? So we're going to talk about that. I have something else very interesting to discuss. I'm not sure we're going to get to it tonight, but let's go ahead and start with the basics. Who were the mirror bearers? This term, which is very familiar to Orthodox Christians, is actually not found in the Bible. It doesn't call them mirror bearers. It didn't say mirror bearers came to the tomb. We chant that all the time in our hymns, but it just says, and Mary Magdalene and Salome and the other Mary came to the tomb. It doesn't call them mirror bearers, but they're the ones who bring these various kinds of aromatic spices that were involved in the burial. So it is the church, the early church, that calls them the mirror bearers. And of course, the Orthodox Church still uses that term today to honor and to recognize these women who cared for Christ, not only when he died, but during his ministry. We're going to talk about that too. They were a very unusual and very extraordinary group of women. And we remember them on the third Sunday of Pascha, not the Sunday after, which is the Sunday of St. Thomas, but the third Sunday is called the Sunday of the mirror bearers. And we also remember Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who also participated in the burial of Christ. But really, it is those women who are the ones that receive most of the attention, I think, on the Sunday of the mirror bearers. So let's go ahead and talk about these ladies. And we're going to discuss, in this case, all four Gospels. Normally, I avoid that because we're talking about Matthew's Gospel. This is a study of Matthew's Gospel. But because we're doing kind of a deep dive into the mirror bearers and trying to understand better what function they had and who were the women like who followed Christ, we're going to talk about what each of the evangelists says about these women. And we're going to begin with Matthew because that's the gospel we're studying. So in Matthew 27, this is what he writes in verse 55. There were also many women there, looking on from afar, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him. So he's talking about at the scene of the crucifixion, as Christ was being crucified, there were also many women there. Notice that he says that. And he mentions only a few. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So he mentions only two by name, one Mary and another Mary, and then mentions another specific woman, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, but he never tells us her name. But he notices and comments upon the fact that there are many women present at the death of Christ, and that, many women, these women had followed him down to Jerusalem from Galilee. So these are people who knew him from his ministry in Galilee. So they're looking on afar. And then what happens? Joseph gets permission to take down the body. He takes the body, wraps it in clean linen, puts it in a new tomb, which had been hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a great stone in front of the tomb. We spoke about that last time. And Matthew remarks that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the sepulcher. Now, I think that Matthew mentions fewer women than anybody else, and that's kind of typical for him. He tends to have the fewest narrative details, but he does mention always first Mary Magdalene. She's always mentioned first because she was so important. She was the leading female disciple. So it tells us that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting opposite, and they were watching Jesus get buried. And this is because they were taking note of what needed to be done or where they were going to return to after the Sabbath. They would return on Sunday morning. So these two women are the ones who will come back in Matthew's gospel on Sunday morning, bringing spices to finish the burial process. Now, every evangelist, as I mentioned, mentions different women, sometimes the same. Of course, Mary Magdalene is always among them. But there was a lot of confusion, and these empty tomb stories reflect a lot of confusion about exactly what happened on the day of resurrection. And I think it's to be expected because of the surprise. The event of the resurrection was a great surprise, and the fact that we have apparently different groups of women probably coming to the tomb. They must have discussed it. Maybe they all planned to come, but they weren't all staying in the same place. So they came at different times to the tomb. And so they witness and experience different things at the tomb. Here's what Mark has. There were also women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome, who, when he was in Galilee, followed him and ministered to him, and also, again, many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So we're going to see that the question about the other Mary, the one who is mentioned after Mary Magdalene, becomes kind of important, and we're really not sure who he is. But this is what it says. Maria y Magdalenicia Maria y tu Jacobu tu Mikru. Que Iosi mitir que Salome. So it's saying Mary Magdalene and Mary, the one of James, Iakovos. In Greek, it's Iakovos, but in English they make it James. The little one, tu Mikru. This is how she's married to, or the mother of James, the little one, tu Mikru. We don't know exactly what that means. It could be less important. It could mean that he was smaller. It could also mean that he was younger. And she is the mother of Ioses, okay? So, and Salome. So this is a big question about exactly which Mary this was and how she was related to this person, Jacob or Iakovos. And because she's described literally as of James, the less, and Joseph's mother. Now, this person, James the less, sometimes, if you've grown up in the American culture, you might have heard of James the less. And usually people say, well, that's the one who's not the son of Zebedee. There is James, who was the more important one, and he was the brother of John, and they were the sons of Zebedee. But this one is just called James the less. We don't know if this is the same person who is one of the 12, because in the lists of the 12 apostles, he's not called James the less. He's called James, the son of Alphaeus. So we don't know if it's the same person. And we don't know whether or not she's married to this person or she's his mother, because it is unclear. Now, why is it unclear? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. At the time that the New Testament was written, there was no punctuation in the writing. Everything was capital letters. All of the sentences and the words strung together. There were no spaces between the words, and there was no punctuation. So you had to figure out as you read it how to punctuate the passage. And so when we read it in the Bible, we have commas and we have question marks and we have full stops, periods, and things like this. But that did not exist at the time. Now, what is the other reason why the gospel readers don't really make it clear? The gospel writers, I should say, not the readers. Because these things were known in the church long before they were ever written down. There was no sense that there was a need to write down every single detail. Who was there? Was she the mother or was she the wife of Iakovos? That was not considered necessary, because all of these details about finding the empty tomb had been told and retold and retold and retold from the year 33, from the time of the resurrection. And as the church grew and spread throughout the Roman world, these stories were told. And where would you hear these stories? In the church. Who would you hear them from? You'd hear them from the apostles. They knew which Mary this was. They knew how she was related to Iakovos. You see my point? So the evangelists never imagined that one day this would be a point of some confusion among us who are reading this now almost 2,000 years later, you see? So we have to remember, I think this is a very important point. You would do well to remember that the early church knew the meanings of these things, because these lessons, these stories about Jesus Christ were told orally. And when the story was told, and where would they tell it? At church or wherever Christians gathered, they would tell these stories. Now, When they told it, do you think people had questions about what Jesus meant or what happened next or something like that? Of course they did. But there was someone there who knew the Lord and who explained it. So the interpretation of the story, the interpretation of the event was passed along orally. When they sat down to write the Gospels, they wrote the story, but they didn't have footnotes or anything like that to include an explanation. The explanation was passed on through the life of the church. That's what we call holy tradition. Do you see? That's why I'm always telling you what we need to do is interpret the Bible according to the teachings of the early church. And these things were known and understood, and the meaning of them were understood long before the Gospels were ever written down, because they didn't run off and start writing Gospels, despite what it seems to show you at on The Chosen, where Matthew and John are there taking notes. That did not happen. That's utterly ridiculous. So let's take a look at Luke. Now, this is what's very interesting with Luke, and Luke is extremely important in what he tells us about the women who were associated with Christ, because Luke mentions more women by name than any other evangelist. And the first time that he talks about them as being an active part of the ministry of Christ, as active followers, is way back in chapter 8. And the resurrection doesn't happen until chapter 24. So they're not like an afterthought for Luke. They're not like also ran, well, oh yeah, the women were there too. No, they are. And he makes an effort to show us how important they were to the ministry. So here is Luke chapter 8. When chapter 8 begins, he mentions how the Lord traveled all around Galilee with the 12. And then in verse 2, this is what St. Luke writes. And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. So a lot of Jesus's followers were women whom he had healed. Okay? And then he mentions some by name. Mary, called Magdalene. Notice she's always first. From whom 7 demons had gone out. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means. Now, what St. Luke is doing here is telling us that these women and many others, he says, were constantly traveling with the Lord and the other disciples, and they were financing the mission. They were providing for the men out of their means. So we're going to talk about what this tells us about these women in a moment, but I want to finish talking about their identities first. So when we get to the almost nearly the last chapter of Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, the very end, the resurrection and ascension are 24, he says this: it was the day of preparation, as after Jesus dies. The Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed. They saw the tomb, how the body was laid. They returned and prepared spices and ointments, and then they rested on the Sabbath. So there he doesn't say who was by the Lord, with the Lord by the cross, and he doesn't mention them, but he's going to mention them later after the resurrection, who ran to tell the disciples that they had seen angels and that the Lord had risen. Now, in the case of John, we know about the sisters of Lazarus. Actually, the sisters of Lazarus are mentioned by Luke also, and without their brother. There's no reference to Lazarus of Bethany in the Gospel of Luke, but we have also another very important woman, that is the mother of Jesus, who appears at the very beginning of John's Gospel at the wedding of Cana, and at the very end, of course, at the cross. And John also mentions other women, and this is kind of interesting. So here's John's description of this scene by the cross. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now that's the only time that Mary Magdalene is mentioned last. Always she's mentioned first. But let's read that list again. It's his mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't give us the name of his mother's sister, but we have 3 Marys and his mother's sister. Now, some people have said that his mother's sister is Mary, the wife of Clopas. So that would be Mary, Mary, and Mary. Okay, this is why it gets so confusing. Now, I think it's extremely unlikely that Mary's own sister, the Virgin Mary's own sister, would also be called Mary. I think that that is very, very unlikely. I suppose it's not impossible, but it seems very unlikely. Instead, as I told you, there were no commas, no punctuation, so it would just read, were his mother's sister, Mary of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. So it was left to the reader to decide whether or not Mary, the wife of Clopas, was the sister of the Virgin Mary. So it is after this, after he mentions the women, that the Lord spoke to his mother and the beloved disciple and gives his mother over to the care of the beloved disciple. So now those are the women that we know about who had been following Jesus from the time he was in Galilee, and not just to come down to Jerusalem for the feast. Luke is the one who tells us that they actively participated in the ministry. They provided for the men. I'm sure they sewed their clothes. I'm sure they cooked for them. They didn't go out to restaurants and things like this. You know, it was a lot of work to take care of these men. And so there were a lot of women who helped. And they were traveling with the Lord, and they were caring for the men, and of course, the Lord himself. So let's talk about the day of resurrection. Which women are named? We're going to start with John. He only mentions one, Mary Magdalene, because he's going to tell us about how she meets the Lord and she doesn't recognize him at first, etc. So that doesn't mean that he was not aware that there were other women. It's just that nobody can tell everything in the story. So John just gave us that one beautiful story about the Lord encountering Mary Magdalene, or she thinks he's a gardener and that sort of thing. So John tells us that story, and he's not suggesting, by limiting his description of the empty tomb to that story, he's not suggesting that there were no other women, because when Mary Magdalene sees the empty tomb, she runs to the upper room, tells the disciples, they have taken my Lord, and I don't know where they have laid him. She says, they have taken my Lord, and we don't know where they have laid him. So she's clearly accompanied by other women. Okay, but they're not mentioned. So in Matthew 28, when we see the description of the discovery of the empty tomb, what does Matthew write? After the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the sepulcher. And then as they're standing there, the stone is rolled away, there's a big earthquake, etc. In Mark, he says this, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary of James, I'm not going to say mother of, because in the text, in my Bible, it says the mother of James, but it doesn't mean, we don't know, it's unclear. I'm going to say it exactly as it would read in Greek. Mary of James and Salome bought spices that they might go and anoint him. And then Luke tells us that the first day of the week, they brought the spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away, and they ran to tell the 12, who did not believe them. The 12 were hiding in the upper room. And then later in the chapter, St. Luke says, who were these women who had come? Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary of James. Okay? Sometimes translated as Mary, the mother of James. And other women who were with them, told this to the apostles. So, who are the myrrh bearers? Of course, the very first one, mentioned all the time, is Mary Magdalene. She is, without a doubt, the leading female disciple of the Lord. And this other Mary, Mary of James, or Mary of Yaakov, she belongs to him somehow. She's attached to him and Joseph. She may have been the mother of James and Joseph, or the wife of James, Yaakov, and the mother of Joseph. Salome, she's also mentioned. Joanna, the wife of Chusa, she's there, and then many others who are not named. But also remembered by the church and considered mirror bearers, and probably were there, but they're not specifically mentioned, are Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be there. They would be part of the entourage. They would have been part of the people around Christ. So I have every reason to think that they were there, but they're not specifically mentioned. Susanna, who is mentioned in chapter 8, but we never see her name again, and we don't really know anything about her. And Mary, the wife of Clopas, she's also considered one of the mirror bearers. So why are these women so important? Well, they are part of the ministry of the Lord. We're seeing the beginning of the church. We are seeing how the church is going to be so radically different from Judaism, which had a very strict separation of men and women, did not give women a voice or much of an ability to participate in ministry. So that's going to change significantly. Now, we do have a caller, and it's Basil, who's from Virginia, I believe. Basil, are you with us?
I'm with you.
Hello, Basil. Welcome to Search the Scriptures Live.
Thank you. Christ has ascended.
Yes, he has, in glory.
Yes.
So what, by the way, since we're on that subject, I've heard people say two different things about how you respond to Christ is ascended. So in my house, I think among the Greeks, they say in glory. What were you taught to say?
Well, in glory.
Okay.
This Sunday, our priest said Christ is ascended, and we got two responses: in glory and
yes.
to heaven.
Oh, interesting. The heaven is a different. I think there's an even longer one. I think I don't know. I don't know about exactly which one is the right one, but that's okay. Eventually, we'll all settle on something. Yes, so, Basil, what is your comment or question?
Okay, so let's see. The question is based on an assumption that men would prepare male bodies for burial and women would prepare female bodies for burial. So Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus have 100 pounds of spices. So yes. I'm thinking that the body is wrapped up. There's spices or whatever they brought, 100 pounds of what men brought.
Yes.
And then they went away. So the women, they're bringing something to anoint the body. What would they have done?
What would they have done? Well, let me answer a couple of things that you bring up. The first thing is that actually, according to Jewish law, women could prepare the body of a man or of a woman, but men could only prepare the body of another man. So they could have, but I guess it seems to have been done by the men. We don't really know. Obviously, the process isn't described to us, so we don't know to what extent they may have assisted in the preparation of the body. We really don't know. So, and also the 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes that Nicodemus brings is a pound equaled 12 ounces. So it was 75 pounds, but it was still a lot. It was a significant amount. So what you're asking, I don't know if anybody can actually answer that question, because this is a question that a lot of people ask. What was left for them to do? It's still possible for them to go and add. It seems that at least Mark suggests that the process was not quite finished, that there were more things that they wanted to add to the body. The other thing is that was part of burial was the mourning, and people used to go to the tomb and grieve and mourn. And tombs in Judea are full of little broken perfume bottles and things like this. So they were masking the stench also by coming. But it seems that they had the desire to add to what they felt perhaps the men did not finish or did not accomplish. I'm going to tell you a joke, okay, Basil? Because I asked this question of Father Costa last night, because I told him I'm going to be talking about the mirror bearers. And I said, Father Costa, why do you think that the mirror bearers had to go back on Sunday to finish? And he said, because the men did a sloppy job. So that's a joke, obviously. But, sometimes there might be some truth to that because we tend to be very fussy about certain things. So anyhow, that's we can't exactly answer that for certain what was in their minds, but clearly there must have been something else that they wanted to add. Perhaps it was perfumes on the top of the body, because it seems that the men had layered some of those substances on the strips that were wrapped around Christ's body. Okay?
Men can only do men, women can do men or women.
Men or women, yeah. That's
okay.
true. That's surprising,
right.
Isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yes, very good. Okay, Basil, well, thanks for calling. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good night. Okay, so let's take a break at this moment. And when we return, we're going to talk about the life of these women. What was life like for women in first century Judaism? So join me after the break.
So here's a question for you. What does it mean to think Orthodox? What are the unspoken and unexplored premises and presumptions underlying what Christians believe? Orthodox Christianity is based on preserving the mind of the early church, its phronima. Dr. Jeannie Constantinou brings her more than 40 years' experience as a professor, Bible teacher, and speaker to bear in explaining what the Orthodox phronima is, how it can be acquired, and how that phronima is expressed in true Orthodox theology, as practiced by those who are properly qualified by both training and a deep relationship with Christ. Thinking Orthodox, now available at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so what do we know about these women? Well, not a lot, unfortunately. We don't know too much about the background of them or what happened to them later. Just a little bit has been handed down from tradition. But let's talk about what we might surmise from what we know about first century Judaism. Well, it had very strict standards in ethics and spirituality and religious obligations for men that were often very different than they were for women. And it makes sense that they would make allowances for women. Women were not required to attend the synagogue. Men were. They were expected to. Women had usually the burden of infants and babies and little children and things like this. So they recognized this. But there were very specific requirements for your spiritual life that men had to follow. We could say deeds or practices that they were supposed to follow that women were not to follow, were not to participate in. Men also had certain religious obligations, like attending temple services, temple festivals, the study of the Torah, and women were exempt from that. Now, something like Passover, which is a required feast, if you were able to climb the steps up to the temple, you were expected to attend. If you're a man, women did not have to attend, but they chose to anyhow, because as you can imagine, life was difficult. Sometimes life was, very full of a lot of drudgery. And these kinds of festivals gave them an opportunity to have some fun, to feast, to see friends, to buy things. And this was part of the participation in a festival such as Passover. But women were exempt from many responsibilities that were required by men under the law. And what happened is that the Jewish rabbis and sages came to decide that the exemption that women were not required or obligated under the law of Moses meant that they were excluded from following them. And that meant that they were forbidden from participating in many of the religious rituals that were part of the spiritual lives of daily worship for Jewish men. Now, these restrictions still exist today. And there are a few things that are only for women, and one of them is saying the prayer over the Sabbath candles, which you may have seen in movies, and it looks very pretty, and it's a lovely prayer, and they wave their hands over the candles, and they cover their eyes and say this lovely prayer. It is actually considered a punishment, not because there's something wrong with saying the prayer over the candles, but it was considered a kind of statement about a woman's sin and inferiority, that she was given that responsibility. And there's a couple of other things that were restricted and only to women, but they were mandated to do these kinds of jobs. So first century Jewish women, as you might imagine, were rarely educated. And it's actually true of a lot of women in most civilizations at that time in antiquity, because what's the point of educating a girl? She's going to run a house. She needs to learn these practical things. That's the way they would have thought of it. So they usually did not learn to read. And they certainly did not become disciples of rabbis the way these women did. Okay, this was absolutely unheard of. In the first century, a man never spoke to a woman in public. Even his wife and his daughter, if she was a very little girl, he might. But as she grew older, as she became 11 or 12 years old, they would not speak to their daughters in public. They would not speak to their wives. It was considered very unseemly. So they certainly didn't speak to, strange women on the streets. And this is why, if you were paying attention a couple weeks ago, when we heard the gospel story of the Lord encountering the woman at the well, the woman of Samaria, when the disciples return and they find him talking to her, they're totally shocked. And they want to say, but they don't have the nerve to say, why are you talking to her? And this is also why he says, go and bring your husband, because it was considered improper for the Lord to speak to her if she had a husband. So this is the way of life of first century women. They weren't allowed to have an intellectual life. Let's put it this way. Where you see this, it's been a long time since this movie came out. I think it was Yentl. Wasn't that the title of it? Starring Barbara Streisand. Barbara Streisand. She is a girl whose father is like a Torah teacher. She knows everything very well. She wants to study Torah, but she's a girl. So she cuts off her hair, pretends to be a boy, and she joins a yeshiva to study the Torah. So these kinds of restrictions still exist in Orthodox Judaism and other sects of very strict Jews. They still exist today. So we don't have that in the church, okay? Jesus Christ spoke to women. Jesus Christ recognized the value of women. He accepted them as disciples, and he established the church. And in the church, we are all treated alike. I'm not talking about ordination. No, well, women can't be priests. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, because if you've never lived a Jewish life, you have no idea what I'm talking about. And probably most of you have not. But in the church, we don't have certain sacraments just for men and other sacraments just for women, and they can't participate in each other's sacraments. We don't have that, except for ordination, which is for obvious reasons. We don't have a spirituality that is just for men, and then a spirituality that is just for women, prayers that are just for men and prayers that are just for women, unless it's for fathers or mothers or something. You understand what I'm saying? So this is something that the Lord brought about. We have the same practices, the same spirituality. We have the same Bible. We say the same prayers, the same sacraments, all of these things as men do. And most men are not clergy. Most men are laymen. So we stand alongside of men and we do the same kinds of things. This was unheard of in Judaism. So the Lord had these women disciples and he encouraged them. Do you remember the story of Mary and Martha that is told in the Gospel of Luke? That the Lord goes to visit them, and Martha's running around. A lot of us ladies can totally identify with that. She wants everything to be beautiful, tasty, delicious, perfect. She wants to please the Lord by, providing a nice meal and all of her guests. And Mary is just sitting there and listening to the Lord teach. And after a while, Martha becomes frustrated and she says, Lord, tell my sister to help me. And what does he say? I mean, it's quite remarkable. We're so accustomed to these stories. They've lost their impact on us. I want you to think about what it meant that he said, she has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken away from her. She was sitting at his feet, and that's the way a disciple is described. The teacher sat on a stool or a bench, and the disciples sat on the floor and listened to him. So he not only allowed her to listen, he encouraged her and said she made the right choice. He didn't say, yeah, your sister has a point, run off, little girl, to the kitchen and help with the serving. He recognized that her ability to learn and to teach, and because she would grow up to become an evangelist too, along with Lazarus and Martha, all of these things were important, that women had a role to play in the church. And he was not concerned about following the rules of Judaism. So this was a tremendous boon to women. And it's very, very sad when we see people criticizing the Christian church and saying that the Christian church has oppressed women. That could be further from the truth. Christ liberated women. He gave them equality within the church and in society. It's the reason why we have this today in society. So why is it that women, generally speaking, however, in first century Judaism, were excluded from a social life in a lot of ways, except among other women? They were excluded from any kind of a public life, any kind of interaction with people. Well, because Jewish religious leaders were very concerned about two things. They considered women to be a source of temptation for men, which is kind of interesting because they considered women to be morally inferior to men. They thought that men were stronger and more likely to resist temptation than women, but they blamed the temptation on the women. That's true. And they also saw women as a very dangerous source of ritual impurity. And even the very conservative forms of Judaism today still have these concerns. They consider women to be impure, unclean at a certain time of the month, not just when she's having a flow, but for several days before and several days afterwards. So religious leaders were very concerned about this, because if a woman should touch them, she would render them ritually unclean, ritually impure. And so they really tried to keep women out of the public sphere so that they couldn't accidentally pollute a man and render him impure. Now, they tended to have a very negative view of women. Now, I'm not saying that men didn't love their wives in Judaism. I'm not saying this at all. But women were perceived as posing a danger to men who were trying to, most men were trying to live an upright Jewish law, following all the laws of ritual purity. Today, most Jews don't. Very few are actually following the laws of ritual purity, the Sabbath regulations, the dietary regulations. Most of them don't do that. But in Christ's time, everybody did, unless you're a sinner, unless you're a tax collector. Everybody followed that. So it was the woman's responsibility to make sure that she didn't unnecessarily cause a man to become unclean by touching him, or him touching an object that she touched. So they were confined to home a lot, all right, a lot. And they were sequestered from the rest of the household, because a man could become unclean by touching something that a menstruating woman had just recently touched, or by touching her, of course, or anything she had touched. So this is very hard for us to understand, but it meant that this made the man unacceptable in the eyes of God, because he's ritually unclean. It's not something you can see physically with your eyes, but that ritually he cannot approach God. He's rejected by God as unclean, and it's her fault. It's her fault because she got him that way. You know, a lot of us have had conversations with the men in our lives who blame us for all kinds of things that we have nothing to do with. It's your fault, right? It's your fault. You did this and you did that. And, you made me do this. Do you remember? Have you had any of those conversations, ladies? I'm sure you have. Imagine if you're living back then. Okay. The responsibility was placed on the woman to make sure that she preserved the ritual cleanliness of the men in the house. Okay? Now, this was considered so important, and men were very afraid of women for this reason, because they had that power by a touch to render them unclean. And nobody could tell just by looking at a woman whether or not she was having her cycle, whether or not she was unclean or not. Nobody could tell just by looking at her. So that's why the men tried to stay away. And that's why recently you might have heard about stories, for example, about Israeli airlines where an Orthodox Jewish man refused to sit next to a woman on a plane. They were standing on the aisle of the plane. They refused to be seated because they didn't want to touch a lady. They don't know. Maybe she's having a cycle, or and she's going to make them unclean. Or there are places, not only in Israel, but other places in heavily Jewish neighborhoods where they have women on one side of the street. They can only walk on one side of the street. Men have to be on the other side of the street. And they do this because they don't want her to maybe bump him in the shoulder and render him unclean. So these are the kinds of daily realities that women had to deal with. Now, of course, they accepted it. This is part of their religion. But I want to tell you how they would try very, very hard to make sure that women did not defile the men in their household. They were told that a woman who defiles a man in her household can die in childbirth. When a woman died in childbirth, it was usually blamed on her, that she had caused the defilement of a man, and this is God's punishment. And of course, we know scientifically that that's not why women died in childbirth. Maybe the baby was breached and it never turned around, but that's what little girls were told from the time that they were young. If you're not careful and you don't keep yourself separated and you don't make sure that you do not defile a man by touching him or any object that he might touch, you're going to die when you have a baby. This is what they were told, and this was emphasized. And by the way, that is in the Talmud. That is something that religious Jews are still studying. And it's a very, very fearsome thing. It's hard to imagine how terrifying this was for women, because you figured you were afraid. It's very difficult not to make a mistake when you're trying to follow some kind of a rule. Sometimes you forget and you make a mistake. Can you imagine recognizing that possibly you made a mistake and you rendered somebody unclean, and because of this, and you're expecting you might die in childbirth? But this was first century Judaism. It is still taught. I don't think it's emphasized as much, obviously, but it's still there in the Talmud. Okay? Now, we're not talking about people who lived in mansions where they have lots of rooms, and the lady, I don't know how they did it. Honest to goodness, I don't know how they did it. She could sequester herself, keep herself separate from all the men in the house, in one part of the house, until her cycle was over. How did they do that? They're not living in mansions. These are not all wealthy people. These are people who live in villages. They have work to do. How did this happen? It was a very, very difficult way of life. But of course, we have to recognize how we see the love of the Lord. And this is shown to us in the story. We already talked about the woman with the issue of blood, right? She has this hemorrhage, and she's determined to be healed. She believes she will be healed if she touches the tassel on the Lord's garment. And she does touch it, and he stops and turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And she was terrified of the reaction of the crowd. She was not supposed to be in a crowd with men being pushed around and jostled while she tried to touch the tassel on the Lord's mantle. But the Lord, did not believe in ritual purity or ritual impurity. What matters is what's in the heart. So I'm telling you this because I want you to understand how much these women loved Christ and why they loved him so much. It's not just that he was inspirational, but he loved them. He valued them. He didn't consider them unclean. He he was not the oppressor of women. He welcomed them into this fold where they played a part in this extraordinary ministry, a ministry of which the world had never seen anything like it. He considered them worthy to accompany him, worthy to touch him, worthy to feed him, worthy to cook for him, to mend his garments, or whatever it was. And all the other men, they just didn't serve Jesus, they served all of the men. Okay, they helped. So they were a very key part of the ministry of the Lord. So it's just like, when we go someplace and, let's say you go to see a play. You see the actors and you admire the skill of the actors and it's a nice presentation. But in order for that to happen, you have all these kinds of people behind the scenes who built the sets and who are pulling up the curtain and who are doing the lights. They're the players who don't get the recognition. These women were the ones who made the ministry of Christ possible, the extent to which he traveled, because he didn't have to worry about where they were going to eat or where they were going to stay or how they were going to pay for somebody's clothes because, it has a tear in it or who's going to mend it. He didn't have to worry about that. They took all of those responsibilities off his shoulders so that he could just preach. And they ran all of these parts of the ministry. So it's quite extraordinary. So under what circumstances would or could a woman become a follower of Jesus? Because women had very limited autonomy. She couldn't say, when I grow up, I want to follow a rabbi. Never happened. Rabbis had no women disciples. Women were not considered worthy of studying the Torah. So rabbis did not have women disciples. Only Jesus did. But a girl was under the control of her father until the age of 12. And between 12 and 12 and a half, he could arrange for her to be married. And she did not have a say in whom she married. If he did not marry her before she was 12 and a half, she could choose her husband. But then she was under his control, whether she chose him or whether her father chose him. She was under the control of a husband. Women did not have hardly any autonomy or self-determination. So she came into a marriage with a dowry, and that dowry was her only protection, so that if she was divorced, if the husband decided to divorce her, then he had to give her the dowry back. So she had some money, some way to live. But while she was married, she had no rights to manage that money, to invest the money, to do anything with it. And do you think husbands sometimes lost their wives' dowry? Yes, they did. And there was nothing she could do about it. That was her security. So the rights of a husband and a wife were spelled out in a marriage contract. This is called a ketubah. So even Jews today have a marriage contract, and they write it up with very fancy lettering, and they frame it, and it's very pretty looking. It's in calligraphy and this sort of a thing. But every person's rights and responsibilities, the husband's rights and responsibilities, are spelled out in the ketubah, the contract, and the wife's rights and responsibilities, down to how she's allowed to have her favorite food, how often she's allowed to go visit her family, how often during the course of the year, he has to buy her new clothes and new sandals. All of these things were specified. The relationship between husband and wife was a contractual one. Again, I'm not saying that Jewish men and women didn't love each other. I'm not suggesting that at all. But the basis of the marriage was a contractual arrangement. And among the things that were specified in the ketubah, I'm talking about back in the time of Christ, was how much she was going to contribute to the household. Now, how did she contribute to the household? Primarily by weaving. Weaving was a job that women did. Cloth was very expensive. It was very time consuming to make cloth. You had to start with the sheep, and then you had to spin the thread out. You had to put it all in a yarn. You had to clean it, of course. You had to spin it. You had to put it in a ball of yarn. You had to set up a loom. You had to put the strings on the loom. You had to put it in and out. This is very time consuming. And they were expected to produce, and this was stipulated, spelled out in the marriage contract, how much fabric they were required to produce. And she was given a break if she had a nursing infant. Otherwise, she didn't get a break. And so the husband had the right to demand this of the wife. So this is very hard for us to understand, because if you can imagine, there was a lot of work. There was no convenient anything. People made everything. They grew everything. It was a lot of work involved. Dressing a family, feeding a family. And the women had to do this. That was their job, unless they were wealthy and had servants. And then she didn't have to physically produce the fabric herself. She could have a servant do her job. So what does this tell us about the mirror bearers, the followers of Jesus? How could women leave their homes and their husbands and travel around following Jesus for weeks at a time, maybe months at a time? Because this is what they did. They were going all over Galilee. So they weren't going home at night and making dinner or picking up something from the store on the way home. They were not doing that. They were with the Lord. So not only is this extraordinary, the idea that Jesus was traveling with women and he was not afraid of ritual impurity, but imagine the husbands. How was it? Because this would be unusual even today. If any one of you had a husband or a wife who said, listen, I want to follow so-and-so, this preacher, for the next few months, can you just fend for yourself? It's much easier for us to do that today because we have all kinds of prepared foods and restaurants and things like this. They didn't have that. How did the husbands manage? How is it that the husbands allowed their wives to leave home? We know they did, because at least one of them is mentioned, Joanna's husband, Chusa, the chief steward of King Herod in Galilee. So he's an important guy. So I suppose he gets his meals there at the palace. It wasn't a big problem, but it's still so unusual. And I think we have to give props or admiration to, or applause to, the men who allowed their women to follow Jesus, because they must have been extremely extraordinary men who believed in Christ too, right? So the mirror bearers, there are some mirror bearers who are mentioned in connection with men. We mentioned the other Mary of Jacob, or, James, and the mother of Joseph. And there is Joanna, the wife of Herod's chief steward, Chusa. But other women are not mentioned in connection with any man. So how old were they? What was their life like? What do we think was probably their background? So let's take a break at this time, and when we come back, we'll continue to discuss the mirror bearers.
The crucifixion and resurrection of Christ are central events in our salvation. Yet few Christians have a good grasp of the first-century historical and religious context in which the crucifixion took place, nor of its true significance for the people of that time, and hence for our time as well. In her book, The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, biblical scholar Dr. Jeannie Constantinou puts modern readers in the center of the events of Christ's Passion, bringing the best of modern scholarship to bear while keeping her interpretation faithful in every particular to the early church tradition. If you love Search the Scriptures live on Ancient Faith Radio, you'll also love The Crucifixion of the King of Glory, available now at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
Okay, so we're talking about the mirror bearers. There are some mirror bearers whose names are mentioned without any connection to a man. Mary Magdalene, she's a Mary. That was obviously a very common name. She is described or identified by the place where she was from, the town of Magdala. Susanna also isn't mentioned as the wife of anybody. Mary and Martha are not mentioned as myrrh bearers, but we know of them from both Luke and John's gospel. They do not seem to be connected to a man or responsible for a man, either as a wife or as a mother. Obviously, they have a brother. So these seem to have been, or probably were, somewhat younger women. And it is also possible that they never married. I think it's likely that Mary and Martha never married, and that Mary Magdalene never married. There is a tradition that she never married, but she may also have been a widow. The time when a woman had the most freedom, I hate to say this, but it's true, is when she was a widow. Okay, maybe that's where the term the merry widow comes from. If her husband died and she had her dowry and she could manage a lot of property if her husband was wealthy. So this is the only time that they had a certain amount of autonomy and freedom. So it's possible that Mary Magdalene was a widow, but maybe not, because she's only identified by her place of origin, Magdala. The great Synaxaristes, I tried to read about Mary Magdalene, and it said that her parents were wealthy, that her father actually did educate her, and both of her parents died when she was 10, and she lived a very pious life. And she met Jesus. Of course, her town was on the western shores of the Sea of Galilee. So, of course, Jesus went all around the Sea of Galilee. So we don't know exactly how it is that she encountered him. But what we do know about her, the only fact we know about her, other than the place where she was from, is that the Lord cast 7 demons out of her. And I'm bringing this up. It's extremely important because she was never a prostitute. She was never an immoral woman. This scandal, this slur, this besmirching of the name of this great saint, the most important female disciple of the Lord, I'm not including the Theotokos, of course, that has been dragged through the mud of history for over 1,400 years now because of a pope, because of Gregory I, also known as Gregory the Great. The Orthodox know him as Gregory the Dialogist. He is the first one ever to say that she was the sinful woman in Luke chapter 7, who brought some ointment. She's a street walker in that story. She finds out that Jesus is at table. He's eating dinner somewhere in the house of a Pharisee. And this sinful woman comes and anoints his feet and cries on his feet and wipes his feet with her hair. That story in the Gospel of Luke, it is Gregory the Great, a bishop of Rome and a saint of the church, who made a big mistake by saying that that's Mary Magdalene, okay? Because she's mentioned a little bit later, so he connected the two. But it was a terrible mistake to make, because to this day, I've got to tell you, I'm shocked when I hear that there are even Orthodox Christians who don't know that Mary Magdalene was never a sinner, never a prostitute, okay? Don't ever say that. There's been some effort at rehabilitating her for some reason in the 1990s. Some scholars suddenly discovered this, and I thought, well, we Orthodox have known that all along. We never refer to her this way. But because of Western influence, still there are Orthodox Christians that think, because they see this in the movies, that she was a prostitute. So this is a terrible, terrible thing to say. And she was, I think we can assume, I think it's fair to assume that she was unmarried, maybe a widow, but she had a lot of money. She was the leading person who financed the ministry of Christ, and she's extremely devoted to him. Another thing that we can certainly say absolutely, with absolute certainty, was that Jesus did not marry her. And it's extraordinary to me how many people just assume, oh yeah, they were probably married. Why do people say these things? It is so wrong to make these kinds of statements. I'm telling you this because one of my students at the university, she had a club, and her the advisor of the club, he's not a theologian, but he's a professor, was talking about how Jesus and Mary were probably married, Mary Magdalene. And she was so shocked because this guy was kind of traditional, kind of conservative. And you, for some reason, because we hear these things in the culture, we just say, yeah, probably they were. This is a terrible thing to say. They were not married. They were not in love. She was devoted to him and as her Lord. So when the body is missing and she runs to the upper tomb, what does Mary say to the 12 or the 11? Because Judas is not there. They have taken my Lord, and we do not know where they have laid him. And then when she sees the Lord, she thinks he's the gardener, says, just tell me where you've taken him and I'll take him away. And he says, Mary, and she recognizes him. What does she say? My husband? She says, Rabboni, Rabbi. That's who he was for her. It was not her husband. There's zero evidence to suggest that Jesus had any kind of romantic relationship with Mary. This is blasphemous. But for some reason, people just very casually repeat these things. So you should be able to say, don't say that. That is not true. There is no evidence of this. And these are things that we have to start speaking up. And we should certainly tell our children. We just assume they're going to know these things, that Mary was never a prostitute. How are they going to know it if we don't tell them these things? Okay? So it is very likely that these women who were following Jesus were either young and never married, people like Mary and Martha, maybe Mary Magdalene, or they were older, like Mary of Yakovos or Mary, the wife of Clopas. So I don't think we had too many of the followers of Jesus who were the women who were in that middle age group who were young moms. That would have been very difficult. So these are either already single women who probably never married, or they were older women whose children were grown, and they were able to go around Galilee following Jesus, camping out from town to town. I just think it's remarkable. I wish we knew more about it. So how could a woman leave her husband and her home, even if her children were grown? The only way she could do this is if she had enough, because men would not like this. You know that, right? Men wouldn't like to be left to fend for themselves, and they couldn't. Okay, they didn't know how to do a lot of these things, and they needed a wife at home to take care of the house and the food and the clothing and the rest. So they couldn't just leave and abdicate their responsibilities. So the only way that these women were able to do that, even if they didn't have young children, is if they had servants. So I think it is a very extremely likely that the women who followed Jesus were not poor. They were well off. They were women of means, and they were able to follow this traveling rabbi, because otherwise they would not be able to, because they would be needed. Their hands would be needed at home to do the work. So, of course, this fits perfectly with what St. Luke said, that they were supplying the needs of Jesus and the disciples out of their own purse. They were supplying whatever, they were financing the ministry. I want to say another thing about these women, that these women were apostles. The mirror bearers, all of them were apostles. Now, I think it's important that we understand the meaning of this word, because today we use the term apostle as synonymous with the 12. There's the 12 and St. Paul, they're the apostles, but not in the early church. The word apostle means one who is sent. So many people were sent out by the Lord to preach. We have not only the 12, Luke tells us about the 70. That's a group that we're very familiar with in the Orthodox Church. There was a larger group of disciples that the Lord sent out to preach. They are also called apostles. But in addition, in general, in the early church, the term apostle was applied to anyone who had been a follower of the earthly Lord during his earthly ministry and who saw him alive again after the resurrection. And all of these women qualify for that, you see? And we know that that term apostle was not denied to women. Now, today, we honor very important women, especially women preachers and evangelists, with somebody like Mary Magdalene, and we call her is apostolos, equal to the apostles, because today the term apostle is restricted to the 12 and Paul. But at that time, she would have been called an apostle. And she would have been, and she and the other women would have been extremely important as eyewitnesses of the resurrection. And we know that she traveled. Other women traveled, like Fotini, the Samaritan woman at the well. She knew the earthly Jesus. She must have seen him alive again afterwards, or she may have seen him. But she becomes an evangelist. We know that Mary and Martha accompany Lazarus, and they become evangelists. They're also preaching. So we know that there were women who were called apostle. And St. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 16. He greets his cousin Andronicus and his wife Junia, who are of note. They were noteworthy among the apostles. That's a husband and wife. In the Orthodox Church, we never tried to hide that. We never tried to make Junia a man. Oh, these are men of the apostles. No, we said there's a husband and wife. They're on our list of saints of the church. We don't say, oh, she can't be an apostle because she's a woman. But in the Catholic Church, they're very, very sensitive about this. They don't ever call a woman an apostle. So I was invited to a nearby Catholic church to talk about the women followers of the Lord. And I said, women apostles of the Lord. And the priest didn't like that title because you cannot call a woman an apostle. And the reason is because they associate the apostleship with priesthood. And of course, women can't be priests in the Catholic Church. So they didn't like the title. They didn't like what I said about the women. But the fact is, historically, we know that women were apostles and teachers and preachers and baptizers. They did all of these things. It has nothing to do with priesthood. Apostle and priesthood are not synonymous. It has more to do with the preaching element. When the Lord sent them out, he sent them out to preach and to teach. So, but this is makes Catholics extremely nervous. So I wanted to discuss something else, but I don't know that I have the time. So what I'm going to do right now is read for you from St. John Chrysostom, and then afterwards I'm going to tell you what we're going to talk about next week. All right, so this is St. John Chrysostom on the Mirror Bearers in his homily 66 on St. Matthew's Gospel. And there was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary sitting over against the sepulchre. For what purpose do these wait by it? As yet they knew nothing great, as was neat and high about him. And for this reason also they had brought ointments, and they were waiting at the tomb, so that if the madness of the Jews should relax, they might go and embrace the body. Do you see the women's courage? Do you see their affection? Do you see their noble spirit in money? Do you see their noble spirit even unto death? Let us men imitate the women. Let us not forsake Jesus in temptations, for they, for him, even while dead, spent so much and exposed their lives to danger. But we, for again I say the same things, neither feed him when hungry, nor clothe him when naked, but seeing him begging, we pass him by. You know, one of St. John Chrysostom's continuing themes is caring for the poor, giving alms to the poor. He talks about this all the time. There were lots of poor in the city, and he expected people to help them. So here he's talking about how when the Lord at the last judgment says, you know, when you did this to one of the least of these, you did it to me. So this, they all know about this, that gospel passage. So he's saying that the women took care of Christ, and yet the men are not doing that. And instead, when you see someone in need, you just pass them by. But it's Christ that you're passing by. If you saw himself, every one of you would strip off all his goods. But even now, it is the same. For he himself has said, I am he. Why then do you not strip yourself of all? For indeed, even now you hear him say, you do it unto me. And there is no difference whether you give to this man or to him. You have nothing less than these women that feed him then, but even so much more. So he wants them to admire the myrrh bearers, but also to recognize that what they're doing by helping the poor is greater than what the myrrh bearers did. So this is what he's going to say. He's going to explain it. Do not be perplexed, for it is not so much to have fed him appearing in his own person, right? If Jesus shows up in his own person, we recognize him. Of course, we're going to rush to feed him and take care of him. But when we do it and not recognizing him because we're doing it for somebody who is disadvantaged, this is greater. This is what Chrysostom is saying. For it is not so much to have fed him appearing in his own person, which would be enough to prevail with the heart of stone, as, because of his mere word, to wait upon the poor, the maimed, and the one whose head is bent down. Refresh him and believe him who receives it, and said, you give to me. For unless you had given it to him, he would not have counted you worthy of a kingdom. If you had not turned away from him, he would not have sent you to hell. Wow. If you had overlooked a chance person, but because it is he himself that is despised, the blame is great. So all of us should imitate those wonderful myrrh bearers by caring for the Lord. He's no longer with us on this earth, but other people are. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the poor. When we serve others, we're serving Christ. And this was his point. Next week, I'm going to tell you more about the spices, because I'm very curious about this too, about the burial process and the spices and the myrrh and the aloes and all these other things that we hear about constantly in the Bible. Where did they come from? How were they produced? What were they like? How were they used? I think it's fascinating. I've been reading a lot of articles about this. And also, there is a question that comes up sometimes about this other Mary. Could that other Mary be the Theotokos? If not, why did the Theotokos come to the tomb? Because this is a question that people still ask. Why is she not among the myrrh bearers? And so there were a couple of explanations that were given for this in the church, in the tradition of the church, but it's kind of complicated and we don't have time to address it tonight. So we're going to address that next week. We're going to talk about the secrets of the myrrh bearers, their substances, what was involved in the actual burial process, and we'll address that question of why the Virgin Mary isn't mentioned among the myrrh bearers, okay? So I hope you will join me next week. I'm Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. You've been listening to Search the Scriptures Live, and this is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. And now, let's close with our prayer. Lord, now let your servants depart in peace according to your word. For our eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared before the face of all peoples, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel. Amen. Good night.
Depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, O